She arrived with a leather suitcase worn at the straps, a dark green notebook inherited from her father, and hands that knew how to make flowers live where no one else believed it to be possible. She came only to tend to a garden that no one had dared to touch for 5 years, and ended up becoming the most beautiful love story that Farm had ever seen. Have you ever arrived somewhere without the slightest intention of staying, with no plan, with no hope for anything beyond the work that needed to be done, and felt in a way you couldn't quite explain that that place had been waiting exactly for you? That the earth beneath your feet, the air around you, and the old stone walls recognized your steps before you even recognized the ground? That something there, silent and patient like a root, had decided you were the right person at the right time for the story that still needed to be told. It happened in April 1934 in the countryside of North Carolina, in a region that the maps called Deep Stone and the locals called the end of the world with a crooked affection, the kind that only those born in the country know how to have. It was there at Camellia Farm that Amelia Alden, daughter of an Irish gardener 28 years old, a specialist in resurrecting what the world had given up for lost, came to change forever a story that already seemed concluded. Without knowing that, by doing so, she would also be completely changing her own. If you are just arriving at this channel, a very warm welcome to Tales of Yesteryear, the place where stories from the past arrive to warm the heart. These stories we tell here are the kind that stay in the heart, that stay in the memory, that we remember months later and tell someone we care about. Tell me here in the comments where you are watching from. It can be from any little corner of America, from the East Coast to the West, from the countryside to the shoreline, from a big city or a little place that doesn't even appear on the map, or even from somewhere else in the world. Each comment here is a company that brings me much joy, and knowing where you are is one of the favorite parts of my week. And now, with an open heart, let us go together to the North Carolina countryside, to the year 1934, to Camellia Farm. Amelia Alden grew up among plants the same way other children grow up among toys, not because she had no choice, but because the choice had been made naturally without anyone needing to force it. Her father, Joseph Alden, had arrived in America from County Cork while still young, with a trunk of seeds and a green-covered notebook full of notes about soil, climate, and the particularities of each species he had learned to know before he even knew his own name well. He was a quiet man, of few words and hands, always with a little earth in the creases of his fingers, the kind of man who communicates more by gesture than by sentence, and whose presence has a tranquil weight that is only noticed when he is no longer there. Joseph had arrived in America without knowing anyone, with no savings and no certainty other than knowing how to make things grow. He found work on a farm in North Carolina, then in Atlanta when the city was still taking its modern shape, and he built his reputation with the kind of patience that only people who work with Earth truly understand. Because Earth does not rush, does not negotiate, does not reward immediacy. Earth responds to those who care consistently over time, without giving up halfway through. Amelia was born in a servants' quarter of a large house in the Inman Park neighborhood in Atlanta, on a November afternoon in 1906, with a fine rain falling outside and the smell of wet earth entering through the open window. Her mother had passed away when she was 4, of a fever that came quickly and allowed no time for anything else, and from then on it had been just her and her father. A duo that found in the gardens they tended a common language that replaced, with surprising efficiency, many of the conversations that other families had in words. Joseph taught without using a teacher's tone. He showed, he pointed, he did it alongside her. One day she was next to him, learning to recognize the difference between soil with a good pH and acidified soil by its smell and color. He did not explain the theory, he just crouched down with her, placed a little of each type in her palm, and told her which was which. The next day she was learning how the angle of a cut on a branch influences where the plant will grow next. The following week, how to distinguish a dormant plant from a dead plant by the flexibility of its thinnest twigs. This way of learning became engraved in Amelia in a manner that no book could reach. It was knowledge that resided in the body, in her hands, her eyes, her knees, that had spent so much time in contact with the earth that the position of crouching down to examine a root felt more natural than standing up. It was knowledge that had a smell, a texture, sometimes a taste. She had learned that certain herbs are tested on the tongue, cautiously, to distinguish species variations that the eye cannot catch. When Joseph died, Amelia was 21 years old, and the dark green notebook he had left on her bed on his last day came with no note, no explanation, just the simple inevitability of a legacy that needed a place to go. She knew immediately what that meant. It was the transfer of a trade. It was his way of saying what he had never been able to say in words. "I trust you to continue. You know enough. Go ahead." She cried for 3 days and then went to work. In the following years, Amelia forged her own path in Atlanta. She worked in the large estates of Buckhead and Ansley Park, tending to the gardens of wealthy families who wanted their spaces beautiful but rarely wanted to understand what lay behind the beauty. She would go, work with the diligence she had learned from her father, never anything less than her best, receive her pay, and return to the small room she rented in the Cabbagetown neighborhood, where she had plants on the windowsills, on the shelves, on any surface a pot could occupy without falling. It was a modest life, but an honest one. She did not complain frequently, because she had learned from her father that complaining about circumstances you cannot change is wasting energy that could go toward cultivating what you can. But there was, in those years in Atlanta, a loneliness she did not name directly, the loneliness of always being the gardener's daughter, never the lady of the house, of being treated well and being completely invisible at the same time, of working with love in spaces that belonged to others and that others would leave behind without a second thought when the time came to move. That is what happened at the end of 1933, when the Montgomerys, a family for whom she had worked for 4 years, caring for a magnificent 3,000-square-foot garden in Buckhead, announced they were moving to New York. They took their suitcases, their furniture, the paintings off the walls, and the Persian rugs. They took the 2 dogs and the cat and the parrot that said good morning with a Brooklyn accent, but they did not take the gardener. And Amelia was left empty-handed in a city that in times of crisis did not have many gardens in need of professional care. There were 4 difficult months. She did odd jobs, helped in smaller houses where the pay barely covered the streetcar fare back and forth, sold seedlings she cultivated in the boarding house's backyard for a few pennies each, sowed when necessary and when it wasn't. Her money dwindled with the relentless regularity of something inevitable, and the end of March 1934 arrived with the rent overdue and a sense of anguish that she tried to push away by thinking of her father's notebook and the lessons he had left behind. "Plants go through droughts, Amelia," he had said once, on a brightly sunlit afternoon when a flower bed had suddenly wilted. "And they stay alive. The root holds on. It always holds on. The plant does not know that the drought will end, but the root holds on anyway." It was in this situation that the letter arrived. It was a handwritten letter, on a Wednesday morning when Amelia had gone down to get the mail with the vague hope that it would be some reply from a large estate she had sent a service proposal to 2 weeks prior. It wasn't. It was a cream-colored paper envelope with careful handwriting, an old and elegant calligraphy signed by a certain Miss Clara Sterling from Deep Stone in the countryside of North Carolina. The lady had heard of Amelia through an apothecary in Atlanta who supplied materials for the Montgomerys' gardens and who had kept the gardener's name with the comment that she was the best professional he had ever had the pleasure of working with. In the letter, Miss Clara explained clearly and directly, without unnecessary detours, There was a garden in her family that had been in a deplorable state for 5 years. An old garden of immense sentimental value that urgently needed to be restored by someone who truly understood the subject. She would pay well, and noted down the amount, which was more than Amelia had earned in any previous job. She offered accommodation at the farm during the period of the work, and the time frame would be determined by the actual necessity of the task, not by an arbitrary number chosen before seeing the garden. If Amelia was interested, she should reply as soon as possible. Amelia read the letter twice, sitting on the edge of the bed, with her father's green notebook on her knee and the silence of the boarding house around her. Then she looked at the plants in the window. A pot of basil that was somewhat begging for a pruning, a small fern she had rescued from the sidewalk the week before, and that was still acclimatizing. A red geranium she had found in an abandoned flower bed 3 weeks earlier, and that was, on that exact morning, displaying its first new leaves opened after days of being curled up. The plant was getting better. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside the notebook, and went to pack her bag. The journey from Atlanta to Deep Stone took almost 2 full days, with all the uncertainties and discomforts that a long trip in 1934 America implied. A stretch by train to Asheville, sitting on a hard wooden bench next to a lady carrying a cage, with a mockingbird that sang for the first 3 hours and slept the following 2. Then a motor coach that left every Tuesday heading toward the countryside farms, with the driver, who was simultaneously owner, mechanic and ticket collector, smoking a pipe in the front seat and humming tunes that no one could identify. And finally, a stretch on foot along the packed dirt road that climbed gently between pastures of dark green grass and strips of dense woods that smelled of dampness and tree resin, up to where the farm appeared at the top of a gentle elevation, like an old painting framed by mountain ridges that, at that late afternoon hour, were purple against a sky turning orange. Amelia stopped on the path when she saw it. Camellia Farm was larger than she had imagined from the words in the letter. The main house was made of stone and light stucco, with 2 stories in the central part and a carved wooden wraparound porch running across the entire front of the ground floor, with turned columns and a balustrade that had been painted white not too long ago. The windows were tall, with green wooden shutters that were open, allowing her to see from afar the golden reflection of the afternoon sun inside the rooms. The lands around it were green pastures with cattle grazing in the distance, and further ahead, on a gentle slope descending from the right side of the house, peach orchards in orderly rows that exuded, even from that distance, that smell of fertile earth and planting which is one of the most comforting things in existence. But what stopped Amelia's feet in the middle of the path, what made her eyes go straight to a specific point before any other, was not the house, nor the lands, nor the serene and full beauty of the southern landscape all around. It was the closed garden. It sat to the left of the main house, separated from the rest of the property by a low, dark stone wall with an iron gate that was secured by a rusted chain and covered by a climbing vine that had overtaken the metal with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. From where Amelia stood, she could see the vegetation growing beyond the wall. Not in an orderly and cultivated way, but in a wild and poetic abandonment, with branches intertwining over the gate, dry leaves accumulated against the stone on the lower side, and in the center of it all a grand southern magnolia that had grown far beyond what was planned and now extended its branches like arms over half the enclosed space. It was a place that had lived with intensity and was now in a state between deep sleep and resignation, as if the vegetation itself did not know for sure what had been decided about it, as if it were waiting. Amelia's heart squeezed in a way she could not precisely name at the time. It wasn't exactly sadness, although it had a trace of sadness. It wasn't just professional recognition, although it had that too. It was a mixture, that specific feeling she had learned to identify over her years of work, which appeared when she encountered a plant that had been abandoned but had not yet given up entirely. A mixture of helplessness in the face of what had been neglected and determination in the face of what could still be saved. It was the emotion of someone who recognizes that there is important work to be done. She was still looking at the garden when she heard quick footsteps on the dry dirt behind her and turned to find Matthew Lawson approaching via the side trail. Matthew was a 44-year-old man with the kind of face that is only formed by decades of working in the sun and being satisfied with it. Dark-haired, with thick eyebrows that slanted slightly toward the center when he thought, which gave him a permanent expression of moderate reflection, and with a mustache trimmed with the discreet care of someone who respects himself without making an issue out of it. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that Amelia later discovered he took off practically nowhere, and carried in his walk that efficiency of someone who takes no unnecessary steps. He arrived with his hand extended and the firm grip of someone who learned early on that a handshake says more about a person than many words. He introduced himself as the farm's foreman and said he had been waiting for her, that Miss Clara had warned of her arrival and sent him to the road to receive her. He said he would take her to the porch where the lady was waiting. And then he looked in the same direction Amelia had been looking, toward the closed garden, and his face changed in a small but perceptible way. A slight contraction near the eyes, a very brief pause in his movement. The manner of someone who sees something that is not new but that still provokes a reaction. Amelia noticed. She did not ask anything. There would be time for questions. Miss Clara Sterling was sitting on the main porch in a rocking chair with embroidery on her lap that was clearly serving more as an object of companionship than as actual work. The threads had barely advanced since she had sat down, judging by the visible section. She was a 67-year-old woman who carried her age the way one carries an achievement, with posture, with grace, in no rush to hide anything. Her white hair was pinned up with tortoiseshell hairpins. Her dress was simple and well cared for, and the smile she raised when Amelia reached the porch step was of that rare kind that arrives before words and remains after them, as if it were the natural state of her face and not a deliberate expression. She rose from the rocking chair with more lightness than her years suggested, placed the embroidery on the seat, and stepped down one stair to clasp Amelia's hands with both of hers. Not the extended hand of formality, but both hands closing over hers in that warm southern way that is genuine affection wrapped in a welcome. She said she was very happy with her arrival. She ordered Matthew to bring more coffee, and she returned to her chair, indicating the wicker armchair next to her with a simple gesture, as if Amelia had already been part of that space for some time. The coffee came strong and hot in a porcelain cup with blue floral rims. There was white farmer's cheese on a small platter and warm cornbread fresh from the oven. Miss Clara waited for Amelia to take her first sip before starting the real conversation. She explained in greater detail what she had written in the letter. The garden had been created by her nephew's mother, Eleanor Sterling, over more than 30 years of careful and passionate work. It was a life's work. The lady had dedicated to that space an attention and a love that everyone on the farm recognized as something special, something beyond a hobby or decoration. It was the most honest expression of who Eleanor had been, and after she passed away 5 years ago, the garden had been closed off. No one went in anymore. No one touched it. And now it was in a state that, if not treated soon and with competence, would be too late for any recovery. Amelia asked carefully who had made the decision to close it. Miss Clara gave a small smile, the kind that carries more information than it hides, like an answer inside an answer, and said it had been Edward, her nephew, the owner of the farm. She waited for Amelia to ask more questions. When Amelia did not, she continued, with a calm voice and no special emphasis, like someone describing the terrain before walking on it. Edward was a good man, of solid character, who managed the farm with seriousness and competence. But he had become very closed off after his mother's death, in a way that Miss Clara had observed with concern for years. The closed garden was the most visible symbol of this. She had needed weeks of careful conversations to convince him to accept the restoration. He had agreed, but with one clear condition, that the work be done with respect, that no one treat that garden as just any space or as a routine task. Amelia said she understood entirely, and that she would never treat any garden as just any space or as a routine task. That she had learned from her father that a garden is always a memory of the person who planted it, and that memory deserved the same respect as anything sacred. Miss Clara looked at her closely for a full second, that look of evaluation that is not judgment but recognition, searching to see if what is being said matches what lies underneath. And then she simply said she knew that she had chosen Amelia carefully, not by chance. Amelia wanted to ask what that meant, but the coffee was good, and the afternoon was beautiful, and there was time to understand things. The room she was given was at the back of the main house, down a hallway with wide plank floors that creaked gently, and a window that faced the peach orchards and the mountain ridges in the distance. It was simple but neat. A wooden bed with a new mattress, a dresser with an oval mirror, a corner table with a candle and a box of matches, a pitcher of fresh water over a wash basin. The window overlooking the orchards caught the sun from the side in the late afternoon and glowed with that golden light that transforms any ordinary thing into something beautiful. Amelia unpacked her bag with care, placed her father's green notebook on the corner table, hung her clothes in the dresser, and stood for a moment at the window, looking at the landscape that stretched all the way to the mountains. The sun was going down. The sky over deep stone had those colors that the countryside knows how to create effortlessly. A deep orange that turns purple, which turns into a gradual and inevitable dark blue, with stars that appear before complete darkness as if they are in a hurry to arrive. The smell that came through the window was dense and good. Moist earth from a recent rain, ripe peaches on the branches, the intense green that the woods produce at the end of the day, that scent that does not belong to any specific plant, but to all of them breathing together at night. Amelia took a long, deep breath. There was something about that place that did not let her completely relax, even exhausted from the journey. It wasn't tension. It was more like when a plant finds a new pot unfamiliar before it settles in. The space was awake around her, and she also needed to be awake inside it. It was a good and restless feeling at the same time, the kind that precedes something important without you knowing yet what it is. She ate an early dinner with Miss Clara and Matthew at a table with a linen cloth and real country food. Pinto beans with simmered collard greens, roasted country chicken that smelled of garlic and bay leaf from before it even reached the table, fluffy rice, and a tomato and onion salad that had been drizzled with olive oil that Miss Clara kept with the care one saves for good things. The conversation was light, about the journey, about the time the garden had been closed, about the farm and its history. Edward did not dine with them. Miss Clara explained, without seeming disturbed, that her nephew had eaten earlier and was in his office handling the accounts. Matthew ate without commenting on the absence, which meant it was customary. Amelia went to sleep that night with a satisfied stomach and her head full of the closed garden she had seen upon arriving. That dense and disordered vegetation pouring over the stone wall, the branches that crossed the rusted gate, the specific silence of a space that had been purposely restricted. She fell asleep thinking about what she would find on the other side of that gate. The next morning, Amelia woke up before the sun finished its ascent. The room was in the bluish twilight of the beginning of the day, and the air smelled of dew and coffee brewing in the kitchen at the back of the house. She dressed in work clothes, grey linen trousers, a button-down blouse with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a scarf tied in her brown hair to keep it out of her face, and went to the garden with the tools she had brought in her bag and her father's notebook. The chain that had secured the iron gate had been removed. Matthew had done it at dawn before she woke up at Miss Clara's request. The gate was merely pushed shut, and Amelia pushed it open with both hands because the rusted hinges resisted before giving way. The creak they made sounded long and sharp in the morning silence, like a drawn-out sigh, as if the garden were exhaling the air it had been holding in for 5 years. She walked in. She stood perfectly still for a full moment. What lay on the other side of the gate was not the desolate chaos it could have been. It was, and this surprised her in a way that left her motionless for a few seconds, something simultaneously sad and extraordinary. The garden had been at one time a thing of great beauty and great intelligence. Even in abandonment, especially in abandonment, it was possible to see the structure that had been planned with love and with knowledge. Flower beds arranged in semicircles around a central pathway of flat stones that still existed, although covered in moss and leaves. Species organized by height in a way that, even overgrown in a disorderly fashion, let the original logic show through. The smallest on the edges, the medium ones in the center, the tallest at the back, forming a sort of living wall around the entire space. There was a stone bench in a corner under the shade of the grand magnolia that had grown far beyond what any planning had foreseen, and that now extended its twisted branches over almost half the garden like an involuntary guardian. There was a stone fountain in the center of the space, dry, with its basin full of decomposing leaves and a fine bright green moss that had taken over the interior of the stone as if it had been painted on with a brush. There were climbing vines that had escaped their trellises and overtaken any vertical surface they found, and there were plants, many plants, in completely varied states, some dead, dry, with brittle twigs that snapped at the slightest touch. Others dormant, bearing that appearance of abandonment that is not death but waiting, and still others, the ones that touched Amelia's heart the most, resisting. Surviving without care, without regular pruning, without any water other than the rain from the sky, with a stubbornness that wasn't heroic but was absolutely real. Ancient roots that had not given up just because someone had locked the gate. The smell was of dampness and decomposing vegetation, not unpleasant but heavy, the scent of a space that had been breathing on its own for too long. The morning light filtered in at oblique angles between the branches and illuminated parts of the garden, while leaving others in deep shadow, creating a chiaroscuro effect that was almost theatrical. Amelia opened her father's notebook to a blank page and began taking notes. It was what he had taught her from the very first time he took her to a real garden. Before anything else, inventory. Look before touching. Understand what is there before deciding what to do. A hasty gardener does more damage than a year of neglect. She walked slowly down the central path, crouching here and there to examine roots, pressing the earth with her fingers, checking stems between 2 fingers, looking for flexibility. She identified what she saw and wrote it down, the name, the state, the position, what surrounded it. Her writing was fast. Her sketches were schematic but precise. Her language was her father's, direct, technical, unadorned, but affectionate in a way that Amelia had never been able to explain to anyone who didn't know her. She was on her second page of notes, crouched near a bed of blue hydrangeas that were alive but in desperate need of attention, when she sensed she was not alone. It wasn't a sound that alerted her. It was the silence changing in quality. The way the space around her reacted to a new presence. She turned slowly. At the entrance to the garden, in the gap of the gate she had left open, stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, covered by a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, work trousers and leather boots that looked frequently used and regularly cared for. Dark hair, a face with distinct features, a perfectly straight posture of someone who grew up being responsible for something and whose body learned that weight permanently, and a gaze that Amelia could not read immediately. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't polite. It was the kind of look that exists only to evaluate and that neither gives away nor receives anything until a judgment is formed. Edward Sterling was 36 years old and had the face of someone who had carried responsibility long enough for it to leave marks, not of fatigue, but of incorporated weight, of being serious not by choice but by necessity. He was handsome, without making the slightest effort to be or not to be. The firm line of his lips could be serenity or the result of years of keeping a controlled expression. Probably both. They looked at each other for a moment that was longer than necessary for a standard greeting and shorter than enough to understand anything. Edward stated in a direct and clear voice, not cold but without any of the introductory courtesies most people use as a buffer, that he was the owner of the farm and that he knew who she was. He said his aunt had explained the arrangement. And then he said with an evident care in the weight of his words, the care of someone who measures what they are going to say before saying it, that there was a condition that needed to be clear from the start, that garden had belonged to his mother. It wasn't just any garden, it was a space that deserved to be treated with the respect one gives to a memory, and that he expected her to understand that. Amelia stood up with the notebook in her hand and looked back at him with the same directness he had used. She said she understood completely, that she had learned from her father that a garden is always the most honest expression of the person who planted it, that every choice of plant, every flower bed, every path says something about the person who created it, and that this deserved exactly the same respect as any other memory, any other heritage. Edward looked at her for a second longer than necessary. Then he nodded, once, briefly. He turned and walked away without further words. Amelia kept her eyes on the spot where he had stood for a moment. Then she turned back to the garden and said, in a low and natural voice, which was how she had always spoken with plants since childhood, that he surely was the kind of man who needed time to open up, like a camellia in early winter. A sleepy hydrangea next to the path gave no answer, but Amelia had, in that silence, the sensation that if it could, it would have agreed. The first 3 days consisted of silent and methodically careful work. Amelia would arrive at the garden before breakfast and stay until mid-afternoon, when the April sun in the south was already serious enough to demand respect. Rest and lunch. Returning in the late afternoon, when the light became gentler and golden, until complete darkness. She started with the cleaning, removing the accumulation of years of dry leaves, cutting away the completely dead branches at the exact points so as not to harm what was alive or dormant, clearing the flower beds of the invasive vegetation that had established itself among the original plants. It was physical work that required constant attention because every decision mattered. A wrong cut in the wrong place could eliminate a plant that had a chance of recovery, and the eye needed to distinguish that swiftly and without hesitation. Matthew Lawson would appear regularly to help with the parts that required heavy lifting or larger tools, moving stones that had shifted out of place on the central path, removing 2 tree roots that had invaded the lower main flower bed and were suffocating the species there, repairing the stone wall in 2 spots where it had given way and where dirt from the outside had begun to spill in. He was a good work partner. He didn't speak aimlessly, but he wasn't introspective in an isolating way. He was simply efficient, the kind who had learned that too many words get in the way of real work. And that shared silence can be as good as conversation when people are of the same species. Gradually, Amelia discovered that he knew a lot about the farm, about its history, about the people who inhabited it, about what had happened over the years, and that he carried this knowledge with the discretion of someone who understands that knowing and speaking are 2 completely different things. On a rest afternoon, sitting on the stone bench in the shade of the magnolia while they drank water from a clay pitcher Matthew had brought, he shared, without being asked, with that naturalness of someone thinking out loud to someone they consider worthy of listening, that he had arrived at the farm when Edward was 18, that he had watched the boy grow up, take the reins earlier than he should have, make difficult decisions with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone who enjoys being serious, but to someone who hasn't found another way to be. That Eleanor had been a woman of quiet strength, the kind who doesn't need to raise her voice for everyone to know who is in charge, who communicates authority by the quality of the attention she gives to things. And that the garden had been, for her, the most honest space on the property, the place where she was herself, without needing to be anything else that the world demanded. Amelia listened and recorded, not in the notebook, but in an internal inventory she kept of people with the same care she used for plants, because she had learned that understanding a garden requires understanding who planted it, and understanding who planted it requires understanding the people around them. Edward did not return to the garden in the first 3 days. She saw him from afar, crossing the yard with that direct walk of a known destination, talking to workers near the corrals, riding a horse toward the pastures in the early hours of the morning, always with a straight posture and the leather hat he wore for work. Once, passing her on the porch at dawn, he greeted her with a short nod, and she replied in the same way, and the two continued in opposite directions with the efficiency of planets in separate orbits that do not collide because each knows exactly where it is. On the 4th morning, when Amelia was working on the flower bed closest to the gate, clearing around a rose bush that had survived with improbable obstinacy and was already showing new leaves on its youngest stems, she heard footsteps on the stone path and didn't need to turn to know it was him. Edward entered the garden without saying anything and walked slowly down the central path, his hands in his pockets, his eyes tracing the flower beds with an expression that did not easily reveal what he was processing. He stopped in front of the blue hydrangeas, the first ones Amelia had treated, the ones already showing 2 firm new shoots emerging at the base. He looked at the plant for a duration that held a different quality from casual observation. There was something in that gaze that was personal, intimate, of someone looking not just at a plant, but at an object of memory. Finally, he asked, his voice a little softer than before, if that hydrangea had a chance. Amelia said yes, that she had checked the root 2 days earlier, and it was healthy. That the new shoots were a clear sign the plant had received the care well and was responding. With regular attention, she would say that in a few weeks it would have new leaves, and in a few weeks beyond that, it might be ready to bloom this season. Edward nodded, slowly, his eyes still on the plant. He said his mother had brought that seedling from Charleston, from the city where she had grown up. That it had taken 3 years to bloom for the first time, and that when it did bloom, she had called everyone in the house to see it, as if it were an event. Amelia said softly that hydrangeas were like that, slow, sometimes stubborn, but that when they decided to bloom, they left no room for doubt. Edward looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that wasn't exactly surprise, but was something in the direction of recognition. The manner of someone who hears something that resonates in an unexpected way. Then he nodded once more, with that brevity that was his native tongue for things that mattered, and walked away. That afternoon, while Amelia worked in the rose bed, and the late afternoon sun made the light run parallel to the ground, she stopped working for a moment. There was something in the arrangement of the plants that she had been registering mechanically in her notes, but that her gardener's eye was beginning to perceive differently. The organization wasn't purely aesthetic. It wasn't just by height or by color or by blooming season. There was another, more subtle logic, which she had seen described in a book of her father's, a thin book with yellowed pages, that Joseph had bought from a bookseller in Atlanta, and that dealt with Victorian English gardens and the language of flowers that had been widely practiced in that century. The language of flowers, floriography, the system of meanings assigned to each species, each color, each combination, which had allowed women in particular to communicate through gardens what social conventions did not let them say directly in words. Amelia stood still in the flower bed for a few seconds, looking around with completely different eyes. Eleanor had not planted a garden. She had written something. That realization changed everything in how Amelia worked and observed. She began to photograph mentally and in her notebook with more careful sketches, not just the condition of the plants, but the relationship between them, the exact position of each species in relation to the ones beside it. The flower beds as sentences, not as isolated groups. She identified them, white camellias, which in the floral language meant perfect love, discreet love, love that needs no declaration because it exists with certainty. Yellow roses, which in that tradition could mean deep friendship but also jealousy, depending on the context. Purple irises, message sent, words spoken. Forget-me-nots, which their very name translated. Myrtles, faithful love. Rosemary, remembrance. Lavender, devotion. She did not yet have the complete key to decipher what Eleanor had written, but she knew there was something there to be read. And this discovery gave the work a dimension that went far beyond technical restoration. It was a conversation with a woman who had departed, conducted through roots and petals. It was on the 5th day, on a morning when the mist still clung between the mountain ridges when she arrived at the garden, that she found the white camellia. It was in the furthest corner of the garden, almost touching the stone wall, where the shade of the magnolia fell heaviest in the late afternoon. It was an old bush, with a thick, twisted trunk, like all the old ones, with bark displaying those gentle cracks of wood that has lived a long time, and branches that spread in all directions with the freedom of something that grew for decades without being trimmed, practically devoid of leaves. At first glance, dead. Amelia stepped closer. She kneeled, she placed her fingers on the trunk, felt the bark, and did not feel complete desiccation, that hardness of completely dead wood. There was a minimal moisture, a minimal resistance, a microscopic flexibility in the younger branches that was not there by chance. She stayed still, with her fingers on the old trunk, and whispered to the camellia that it had waited quite a while. That help had arrived. Then she began to clear around the trunk with her hands, removing the layers of dry leaves and hardened dirt from the surface. And it was then, with her fingers in the dark, damp earth beneath all that, in the soil near the oldest roots, that she felt something that was neither root nor stone. It was a box, small, made of dark wood, with a metal clasp, wrapped in coarse burlap cloth that had fulfilled its function of preservation with competence, protection from the years, from the moisture, from the weight of the earth above it. Amelia pulled it from the dirt with careful hands, slowly, with the kind of attention one gives to things that were placed there with intent. She wiped off the excess dirt with the handkerchief from her pocket. She sat with the box in her hands, her heart beating at a slightly different rhythm than normal. She did not yet know what was inside, but she had learned from her father that when the earth reveals something, it is not by accident. The earth guards what needs to be guarded and releases what its time has come. She did not open the box right there. She took it to her room, placed it on the small table next to her father's green notebook, and stared at it for a long time she could not measure. The afternoon light came through the window and fell exactly on the table, illuminating the two objects together, Joseph's green notebook and Eleanor's dark wooden box. With that golden late afternoon light, that turns simple things into things that feel like part of something greater. There were two possibilities: open it and understand what it was before making any decision, or take it straight to Edward or to Miss Clara unopened. The second was more correct in theory. The box was buried in his mother's garden and belonged to him by any right one could invoke. But there was a practical problem with that option. If she went to Edward with the box without knowing what was inside, he might close it back up and put it away, never open it. And there was something in that carefully planned garden, in that carefully buried box, that said, with that voice that does not use words but which Amelia had learned to hear, that what was there had been placed with a specific intention, to be found, to be delivered, and that simply passing along the closed package without understanding what it was could be a waste of something that mattered deeply. She opened it. Inside was a notebook, smaller than hers. A black leather cover, worn at the edges from the use of many hands and much time. Initials engraved on the cover in discreet letters: E.S. Eleanor Sterling. The pages, preserved by the wooden box and the burlap cloth, were in a condition that surprised Amelia in their integrity, yellowed at the edges, carrying the dense and specific smell of paper that had lived a long time, but legible. The handwriting was the same as the letter from Miss Clara, but different because it was more intimate, less controlled, with the strokes varying according to the inner state of the writer. A handwriting that told truths about mood and emotion that the person writing it perhaps did not realize she was telling. Amelia read the first page carefully. It was a diary entry. Date: March 12th, 1901. Eleanor Sterling, a young newlywed, had arrived at Camellia Farm, bringing with her the first seedlings she had bought in Charleston. She wrote about the garden with that mixture of a beginner's enthusiasm and the determination of someone who has a plan, describing each species, the reason for each choice, the meaning she gave to each one. She wrote about the farm, about how different it was from everything she had known in Charleston, about how the soil in deep stone had a quality that she needed to learn to understand before presuming she knew what to do with it. And in the last lines of the first entry she wrote, with that discretion of someone writing for their own eyes, about a man. She did not say his name. She referred to him only as he, as if his name were so present it did not need to be spoken, as if writing for herself made the name unnecessary. Amelia closed the notebook. She sat with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she rested it on the table next to her father's notebook, with the absolute awareness that there was something there that was not hers, that belonged to Edward, that had been placed under the oldest white camellia in the garden with the intention of being found by someone who would know what to do with it. There was a right way to do this, and the right way was not the most rushed one. She returned to the garden the next morning with the black notebook hidden inside hers, and with a quiet determination to understand before acting. Over the next few days, while the garden continued to reveal itself and the resilient plants responded to the attention, with a gratitude visible in the new shoots and the leaves straightening up, Amelia read Eleanor's notebook at night. By the light of the oil lamp and the deep silence of the countryside all around, she discovered, entry by entry, the woman who had created that extraordinary space. Eleanor had arrived at the farm young and determined, but not without anxiety. She was the daughter of a modest Charleston family, well-educated, intelligent, raised to be a good wife and a good household manager, but with an inner life that the notebook revealed to be rich and complex, and for which the conventions of a 1901 offered few spaces for expression. The garden had been, from the first year, that space, the place where she thought out loud, made decisions, processed joys and hardships, loved freely. She wrote about her husband, Arthur Sterling, with an honesty that is the honesty of someone who writes only for herself and therefore can tell the truth without protocol. Arthur was a good man. That was on every page, even when the pages were about difficulties. He was hard-working, responsible, loyal, the kind of man who builds solid things because he knows no other way. But he was also difficult. His pride was immense, and his expression of feelings was minimal, the most common and most painful combination in men raised to manage and not to name what they feel. There were moments when Eleanor wrote about him, with a tenderness that overflowed from the lines, that you could feel in the stroke of the pen. And there were moments when she wrote about the distance between them, with a contained sorrow that never turned into resentment, but that also never completely vanished. The entries about Edward began when he was about 12, 13 years old, and these were the entries Amelia read with the most attention. Eleanor described a serious young man, very much like his father, bearing the pride and the difficulty of expression that were a direct inheritance, but which came wrapped in a loyalty and a sense of responsibility she admired. And she described, with a sorrow that grew over the years, a disagreement between father and son that had started small and had grown like those plants that seem harmless and suddenly are taking over the entire flower bed. The disagreement had been over the farm, over a decision Arthur had made without consulting Edward, who was then about 20 and considered himself a partner in management. A decision about land, selling a piece to a neighbour for an amount Edward considered unfair without letting them know. The hurt had turned to silence, the silence had turned to distance, and the distance had calcified into a mutual pride that neither of them knew how to cross. Arthur had died before the matter was resolved, and Edward was left with the hurt locked in the same place where he locked away everything that was too heavy to be spoken. That deep place where things remain unresolved, and sometimes we think they've gone quiet, when in truth they keep working underneath like roots we cannot see. The last entries in the notebook, written in the more trembling handwriting of Eleanor's final months of life, were the most intense and the clearest. She wrote with the clarity of someone who knows they are saying goodbye and can therefore say things without the filter of someone who still has time. Each plant in the garden carried a meaning she described in detail, as if she wanted someone to find it one day and understand every word she had planted. And on the last pages, preceded by a half-page introduction explaining why she had decided to put it there, was a letter addressed to Edward. Amelia read it slowly, her heart constrained. Eleanor wrote to her son with that tenderness without protocol that sometimes only comes when there is nothing left to lose in being honest. She wrote about the love she had held for him since the day he was born, and that had grown alongside him in a way that did not fit into normal words. She wrote about the heartbreak of seeing father and son separated by a pride that belonged deep down to both of them, because Edward had inherited from his father not just his seriousness, but also that specific difficulty of crossing over to the other side once hurt has built a wall. And then she wrote the truth that Edward did not know. Arthur had tried to fix it. In his last year of life, when he realized he was running out of time, he had written a letter to his son. A long letter, according to what Eleanor described, containing an apology for the way he had made that decision, an explanation of motives Edward had not listened to at the time, a declaration of pride in the man his son had become that Arthur had never managed to say in person. He had handed the letter to a trusted employee, a man named Gerald, with specific instructions to deliver it to his son when the right moment came. Gerald had left the farm weeks later for unrelated reasons, and the letter had departed with him. Edward had never received it. Eleanor had learned of this too late, discovering through an indirect path, after Arthur had passed away, that the letter had never arrived. And she had kept this fact, the information that the father had tried, that the final silence had not been indifference, but a man who didn't know how to cross his own distance, and had attempted a way that failed by chance. She had kept this fact in the notebook beneath the oldest camellia in the garden because she believed Edward would need to know. Someday, when he was ready, when someone found it. Amelia closed Eleanor's notebook with slightly trembling hands. She stared at the ceiling of her room for a long time, the smell of old paper still on her fingertips and an absolute clarity regarding what had been placed in her hands. And with the full awareness that the way she would deliver it to Edward mattered as much as the content, perhaps more. The next morning, Edward appeared in the garden earlier than he had appeared up to that point. He was there when Amelia arrived, standing near the rose bed, looking at something she didn't identify right away, but which, upon drawing nearer, she saw were two small buds that had appeared on the main rose bush overnight. She didn't say good morning right away. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the buds along with him, letting the silence be what it needed to be. He was the one who spoke first. He said, with the voice that carried that different texture of mornings, lower, more defenseless, that he had stopped by before heading to the fields and had lingered a while. He said it as an explanation, not as an excuse. Amelia said he could stay as long as he liked, that the garden had no schedule. Edward stayed a moment and then asked if she needed any help. The question came out with a small and very honest clumsiness. It was clearly someone who didn't know how to do gardening, but was making the offer in good faith. Amelia considered with a smile she kept small, because she felt a big smile might embarrass him. She said there was soil to be turned in the back flower bed if he wanted. Physical, simple work, requiring no specific knowledge. He said yes. And so Edward Sterling, farm owner, manager of tobacco lands and cattle, man of decisions and responsibilities, spent an hour turning soil in a lavender bed next to a gardener from Atlanta with a dirty work shirt and dirty hands and an expression that was the most relaxed Amelia had seen on him so far. They worked in the company of silence and the morning birds. Sometimes he would ask a question, what this species was, why that bed was organized this way and not another way. And she explained with pleasure, without condescension, like someone who genuinely enjoys talking about what they know and recognizes true attention in the listener. Sometimes they would remain silent for a long stretch, and the silence was good, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. When Edward left for the fields that morning, there was dirt on his hands and a different expression on his face. Matthew, who had arrived for a task near the wall and had witnessed the scene without appearing to see it, waited for Edward to exit the garden to look at Amelia with a slightly raised eyebrow. She said before he could say anything that it was just gardening. Matthew said yes, it certainly was. It was that afternoon, while working in the white camellia's bed, carefully clearing around the old trunk with the earth that had been turned in the morning by Edward's hands, that Amelia decided. It wasn't the easy decision. It was the right decision, which sometimes are different things. She went to her room, retrieved Eleanor's notebook, and went to find Edward in his office. The door was ajar, and he was at his desk with account papers in front of him, his head slightly bowed, concentrated. She knocked twice on the wood. He looked up. She said there was something she needed to show him, that she had found it in the garden, under the oldest white camellia, that she had read it because she needed to understand what it was before knowing what to do, and that what was in there belonged to him. She placed Eleanor's notebook on the desk. Edward looked at the object for a second without touching it. Then he raised his eyes to Amelia with an expression that was hard to read, a mix of several things processing all at once. He asked what it was. She said it was his mother's diary, that it had been put away on purpose to be found, and that there was, in the last pages, a letter Eleanor had written to him. A silence of a few seconds. Edward said, his voice dropping lower, that she had read his mother's diary. Amelia said yes, that it had been necessary to understand what to do with it, and that she apologized for that. But she did not regret it, because without having read it, she wouldn't know it was urgent to deliver. Another silence. Longer. She said she was going to leave him, that if he wanted, she could stay on the porch or go to the garden, whatever was better for him, that she was available if he needed anything. Edward said with a brevity that was a plea for something he did not name directly, but which was completely visible, that she should stay. They went to the back porch, Edward with the notebook, Amelia 2 steps behind. They sat in the wooden chairs with the sun sinking over the garden. Edward opened the notebook and read. Amelia kept her eyes on the garden and the late afternoon birds and the sky that kept changing color with that hypnotic slowness. She did not look at him directly, but she was entirely there. He read for a long time. The pages turned carefully. Sometimes the cadence stopped for a moment, a longer pause on a specific page, and then resumed. The silence between the two possessed a dense quality, the kind that exists when something important is happening and words would know they are intruders. When he reached the last pages, the cadence stopped completely for a while. Amelia heard his breathing become a little deeper. She remained absolutely still. Edward closed the notebook. He sat with it in his lap, his hands on the leather cover, his gaze fixed on the garden turning golden with the late afternoon sun. Then he said, his voice low but absolutely steady, that his father had tried. Amelia said yes. He said he had not imagined it, that he had thought for years that the silence was a choice, that he had interpreted his death without resolution as a form of confirmation that the hurt had not mattered enough to be resolved. Amelia said nothing. She let the words exist in the space around them without correcting or consoling them prematurely. Edward passed his hand over his face, a quick single gesture that contained more than it revealed. Then he sat straight again, his hand on the notebook, his gaze on the horizon where the mountains were turning blue with the onset of night. He said, with a stillness that is the stillness of someone smoothing out something that had been tightly folded for a long time, that his mother had known this and had kept it for when the time was right. Amelia said yes, that Eleanor had chosen well where to keep it. Edward turned to her then, and there was on his face, on that face that had always been careful with what it allowed to show, something that was different from all the other times. It was the expression of someone who just set down on the floor a weight he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it was like to be without it. The musculature was still learning the lightness. He was vulnerable and whole at the same time, in a way Amelia had not seen in him before, and that touched her in a way she felt in the center of her chest. He said he didn't know how to thank her. She said, with a small smile that came naturally, that there was nothing to thank, that it had been the white camellia that had guarded that for all those years. She had merely cleared the earth around it. Edward looked at her with an expression that held something of admiration, not surface admiration, but the deeper kind of someone who recognizes in another person a quality they consider rare and truly respects. And then, for the first time since Amelia had arrived at the farm, he smiled. Not a big smile, a real small smile that came slowly and stayed for a second before leaving, but that had arrived genuinely, and that was different from any courtesy. Amelia returned to her room that night with the smell of earth on her hands and the silence of the country all around, and lay awake for a while looking at her father's green notebook and thinking that there was a very important difference between arriving at a place and belonging to it, and that this difference sometimes is discovered in the most unexpected moment. Here, friends of tales of yesteryear, we must take a brief pause. If you have made it this far in this story, you already know it has everything the heart needs, love that is born slowly, truly, with care, and with roots. If you are enjoying it, leave your like right now. It helps the channel grow a lot and allows me to keep bringing stories like this to you. And if you have someone you care about who would also be moved by this, send them the video right away. Let us continue. The garden blossomed with a speed that made Matthew shake his head more than once with that affectionate disbelief of someone who sees something he didn't expect but cannot deny. In the second full week of work, the blue hydrangeas, the first ones Edward had asked about, the ones that came from Charleston, opened their first clusters. A blue that was almost violet, deep and moist after a rain that had fallen on Thursday, with those groupings of small flowers that together form something immense. It was the type of bloom that asks to be looked at for a while. The roses began opening buds. The lavender bed, which had seemed completely lost in the first week of inspection, revealed new branches growing straight and firm, with a determination that was no different from pure survival. But that felt, in the way things feel when they happen at the right moment, almost miraculous. Edward appeared in the garden every day now, without any pretext, without the transparent artifice of just passing by. He would arrive, stay a while, sometimes ask questions, sometimes help with whatever required strength, sometimes merely stand watching the plants, answering the care with a loyalty that only those who have loved a garden understand. Amelia showed him throughout those days what she had discovered about Eleanor's language of flowers, not all at once, gradually, like someone opening a book page by page, because they know the right reading rhythm is the one that lets each thing settle before continuing. She would point out a combination of plants in a bed and explain what she had deciphered, the love that persists even without being spoken, the hope that does not give up even without guarantees. The memory that cares even after the planter has gone. Edward listened with an attention Amelia had learned to recognize as the most honest he possessed. That whole-body attention, without the drifting gaze or the expression showing the thought had wandered elsewhere. When he truly listened, he was completely there. And there was something happening in those days of garden and conversation that was more than the work. There was the gradual establishment of their own language between the two of them, unplanned, undeclared, but real. The way Edward would arrive with coffee when he noticed she had been in the garden a long time, the way she would save up without being asked the discoveries of the day, to tell him when he appeared, the way the two could stand in silence side by side for a long time without the silence demanding a thing. The way he learned the names of the plants with the interest of someone who truly wants to know, not to impress, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to understand what she understood. There were afternoons when Amelia was in the flower bed and noticed he was looking at her in a way that was different from looking at the garden. And there were afternoons when he noticed she had noticed, and the two would return to work with that slightly heightened awareness that is the antechamber to something else. On one of these afternoons, a rainstorm arrived suddenly, the kind of southern country rain that appears without warning, with a smell of wet earth that precedes the drops by a few seconds like an announcement. They were in the middle of the garden when it started, and Amelia's first instinct was to grab the tools she had left on a flower bed. Edward's first instinct was to grab the tools too, from the same bed, and they both reached the object at the same time, their hands almost touching on the handle of the small hoe. They stayed like that for a second, standing under the rain that was already heavy, their hands a few inches apart, and their eyes meeting before either decided what to do. Edward took the tool with a half smile. He said they were going to get wet if they didn't go inside. Amelia said they were already getting wet. They went to the back porch, the smaller wooden one, which had a wider roof that shielded them from the driving rain. They stood there, looking at the garden that the rain transformed into another place, darker, more fragrant, with the earth drinking the water with visible haste and the leaves shining a more intense green than before. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was loud enough that conversation required a certain proximity to be heard. Edward said, without looking at her, that there was something about the garden in the rain that was different from everything else. That, when he was young, he believed the rain transformed the plants in a way the watering can couldn't. that there was a visible distinction between the garden before and after, as if the plants had breathed differently. That his mother used to say, "Plants wait for rain," the same way people wait for something that is going to arrive, and that is going to be good. Amelia said her father had taught the same thing, with a more technical explanation. That rainwater has a different pH than well water, and plants feel this in their roots, but there was also the matter of temperature. Summer rain arrives warm, and warm is what most plants prefer. Edward looked at her. He said, with the tone she had learned to recognize as the tone of real things, that he liked learning these things from her. That he had learned more about the land he had spent his life managing in those weeks of garden and conversation than he had learned in the previous years. Amelia felt that land somewhere that wasn't just in her ears. The rain lasted about 20 minutes and stopped the same way it had arrived. Suddenly, the garden after the rain had that clean, brilliant quality that is one of the most beautiful in existence, with every leaf greener and the earth darkened, and the scent of petrichor that is something human beings recognize as good from before they know its name. They went back to the garden together when it stopped, without agreeing to it, without saying they were going. They simply went. That same month, Matthew called Edward for a conversation he had been postponing because he considered it not strictly within a foreman's purview. It was just the two of them in the yard at the end of the day, the workers already dispersed to their homes. Matthew stated directly and without flourish, because he wasn't the kind of man to wrap things up more than necessary, that he had observed something over the last weeks he considered relevant to mention. Not as an intrusion, but as 18 years of loyal friendship. Edward said he should speak. Matthew said there was a girl in the garden who looked at the farm the way one looks at home, not as a visitor, not as temporary work, as a place, and that there was a man on this farm who had gone back to looking at his own space with the eyes of someone who sees what he has, and not just what he has to manage. And that, in his modest and unsolicited opinion, these two facts were related and deserved attention, before one of the two left without anything having been said. Edward was silent for a few seconds. Matthew stated he was finished, and that the pasture report was on the desk in the office. Edward replied, with a voice that tried to be neutral and didn't completely succeed, that Matthew was a man with much more opinion than a foreman needed to have. Matthew said he probably was. And he walked away with his usual efficient stride, leaving Edward standing in the yard with the cooling afternoon around him, and some thoughts that no longer needed any help following the path they were on. Miss Clara watched all this with the serenity of someone seeing exactly what she had expected to see and having the delicacy not to make a conversation out of it. On an afternoon when the two of them were alone on the porch, the older lady said, without lifting her eyes from the embroidery that this time was actually being embroidered, that her nephew had asked that morning how the white camellia's recovery was coming along. He had asked with a specific detail of interest that went beyond care for the garden in general. Amelia said the camellia was responding well. Miss Clara said yes, she had noticed that too. There was a discreet smile at the corner of her mouth that was not mockery, but genuine joy, the kind people feel when something they hoped for with fondness finally begins to happen. Matthew, for his part, had developed the habit of appearing in the garden at times that coincided with Edward's, with a regularity that could not be completely accidental. And when Amelia confronted him about it one afternoon, with a look that required no words, he said, with the absolute seriousness of someone being completely sincere, that he was checking the condition of some stones in the wall that needed attention. The stones were perfectly fine. Amelia told him he was a terrible actor. He said he was an excellent manager of complex situations. She laughed, a genuine laugh that came out full and free, that had not been planned, and because of that, was better than any planned laugh could be. And she realized, as she laughed, that there was a different quality to the days there, that she had arrived with the weight of 4 months of hardship, and that weight had become lighter, not because the practical problems had vanished, but because she had found a space where she existed wholly, where the work she did mattered, and the people around her truly saw her. On a Tuesday afternoon, near the end of the third week, something happened that had no gardening explanation. They were in the corner by the white camellia. Edward had arrived earlier than usual, with the sun still high, and he had asked about the meaning of white camellias in the language Eleanor had used. Amelia had explained: discreet love, perfect love, love that exists with certainty but doesn't need to be announced because it is too evident to need announcing. Love that blooms slowly, that takes time to show what it is, but when it shows it, leaves no doubt. Edward had stayed silent, listening to this, his eyes on the camellia. And then he had raised his gaze to her. It wasn't a conversational gaze. It wasn't the work gaze, nor the evaluative gaze he had in the beginning, nor the gaze of paying attention to what she was explaining. It was a different look, the kind that doesn't need context because it is the entire context. Saying a whole thing without using a single word, Amelia became absolutely still, like when you are near something that might slip away if there is a sudden movement. Like when the first flower of a plant that took a long time to bloom is about to open, and any interference could disturb the process. Edward said, with that directness that was his native language, without excess flourish, but with an intensity that made each simple word weigh more than it should, that he had realized something. That he wasn't good with words of this kind, that he had learned early on that feelings were demonstrated by actions and that words often arrived late or arrived wrong. But he had also learned from his mother's notebook and from everything that had resolved itself in those weeks that silence sometimes cost too much. Amelia waited, her heart at a rhythm she recognized as the rhythm of when something important is about to happen. He said there was something different on that farm since she had arrived. It wasn't just the garden, though the garden was a visible part. It was himself. He had become someone he liked being more in these days than he had liked in a long time. He had returned to walking in that space without the weight he had carried for years. He had read his mother's letter and felt that things that seemed closed could be opened again. He had realized throughout those weeks that there was something happening that he didn't know how to precisely name, but that wasn't just gratitude, that it was more than that. He said he didn't want her to leave without knowing that there was something real there. Amelia sat with those words for a moment, let them truly arrive without filtering them through her usual caution. And then she said, with an honesty that came naturally without needing to be chosen, that she had indeed noticed. That she had arrived thinking she would stay 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks had passed, and she had realized she wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. That there was something in that garden, and on that farm, and in those daily conversations, that made the rest of the world seem further away than usual. Not in a sad way. In the way that when you are in the right place, other places lose their urgency. The sun had reached that point in the afternoon where it ran parallel to the ground, and the garden was completely golden, the light filtering in at an angle through the branches, creating long shadows across the flower beds, making each leaf shine on one side and cast shade on the other. The white camellia was between them, with its twisted trunk and its long history, and on the newest branches, Amelia noticed at that exact moment 3 small, firm buds that had appeared while they were talking. She pointed them out to Edward. He saw them. He stared at them for a second, and the smile that came to his face this time was the freest of all he had given. Wider, deeper. The kind that happens when something you have waited for a long time is finally confirmed, and your entire body answers to the confirmation. The month that followed was different in a way that was difficult to describe with words, but impossible not to notice for anyone around. The garden advanced into bloom with a beauty that made sense. Not a miracle, but accumulated care yielding its natural return. And between Amelia and Edward had grown something that was also not a miracle, but accumulated care, attention, presence, that kind of familiarity that is built when two people stop performing for each other and simply exist in the same space with honesty. Edward had begun to ask about the plants with the interest of someone who genuinely wants to understand, about what each species needed, about how the soil was prepared for winter, about what to do so the garden would stay alive after Amelia left. This last question had slipped out in a way that revealed more than he had planned, and when Amelia caught what lay beneath it, the assumption that she was still leaving, that sadness wrapped in a practical question, she felt something in her chest that was hard to ignore. There were afternoons when the two would sit on the stone bench under the magnolia after work, with the smell of dirt on their hands and the end of the day settling around them, and they would talk. About big things and small things with no distinction in weight, about what it was like growing up in deep stone, about the Atlanta that was changing too fast for those who grew up in it slowly, about Amelia's father and the gardens he had loved, about Arthur Sterling and the peace that had arrived with Eleanor's letter. Edward spoke about his father with an openness he hadn't possessed before, not with easy longing, but with that more complicated longing of someone who loved someone who was hard to love, and who now, with the truth resolved, could finally keep the good parts. There was an afternoon when Amelia was saying something about plants, and noticed Edward was listening with a small smile at the corner of his mouth. Not out of mockery, but affection. The kind that appears when you are listening to someone you care about talk about what they love. There was an afternoon when he came to help and stood closer than necessary for the task, with that proximity that isn't accidental but doesn't yet want to be declared, existing in a space between what already is and what hasn't yet been spoken. Miss Clara, on a tea afternoon when the two of them were alone, said, with the voice of someone thinking out loud about something they've considered for a long time, that she had waited many years to see her nephew look at someone that way. That there had been women who had passed through the farm over the years, acquaintances from neighbouring families, daughters of deep stone merchants. And Edward had always been courteous, proper, and completely absent in a deeper way. She said she had realized, when she decided to write that letter to the gardener in Atlanta, that she needed someone who understood things that grow slowly and know how to wait. Amelia asked, with a smile she couldn't fully contain, if Miss Clara had hired a gardener or arranged something else. The older lady stated, with the most perfect seriousness, that she had hired a gardener, that the garden needed restoration, that was a fact, and that the rest had been entirely and completely a coincidence. There was something in her eyes that said otherwise. But Amelia didn't press the matter. She drank her tea and sat with the warmth of the cup in her hands and the warmth of something else in her chest that she could no longer pretend was just the work. Christmas 1934 arrived with the garden in a state that was not yet the splendor it had once been, for that it would need a few more seasons, but was already something real and beautiful, with species blooming in strategic spots Eleanor had planned for the summer, with the pathways cleared and the borders of the beds defined, and the stone fountain that had been cleaned and that Matthew had fixed to work again, with water running softly in the center of the space, as if it always had. Miss Clara had invited some neighboring families for a simple celebration. The party had stayed on the porch in the yard and finally had reached the garden, where the paper lanterns Amelia had suggested were hung between the branches of the magnolia and created a warm, golden light effect over the flowers that left the visitors standing still for whole minutes, watching with that expression of when beauty arrives by surprise and catches you unprepared to react in any other way but to stay motionless. Edward stayed by Amelia's side during a good part of that night, not ostensibly, not in a way that demanded attention, in the natural and discreet manner of two who no longer need to justify being close, who have found a common territory where the presence of the other is the normal state and absence. is what asks for an explanation. He introduced her to the families with a care in his tone that did not go unnoticed by the people who had known him for a long time. Matthew noticed, the older families noticed, Miss Clara noticed with that serene expression of someone confirming something she already knew. At a certain hour of the night, when the party's volume had lowered, and those remaining were the closest ones, Edward and Amelia found themselves alone for a time in the quietest corner of the garden, near the stone bench. The lanterns swayed slightly in the warm breeze, and the scent of jasmine that had bloomed that month mingled with the smoke from the candles. The sky over North Carolina in December is a specific thing, full of stars that seem closer than they should, with a quality of presence that makes the night feel alive. Edward stated, looking at the garden around them, that there was something he had not said yet. That he wasn't the type to say things in places with a lot of people, but there was something he didn't want to leave for another day. He said he had realized in the months he had known her that there was a difference between the life he had been living before and the life he was living after. It wasn't just the resolution of the issues with his father, though that was vast. It was something else. It was the way he had started looking at his own space, the garden, the farm, the days, with an attention he had lost a long time ago. How he had gone back to noticing the things around him with the presence that Amelia's father, from what she had told him, had taught was necessary to make anything truly grow. He said this had happened because she had arrived. That he didn't believe in reasonless coincidences, but that there were things that only made sense later when you saw where they had led. Amelia listened to all of it, with the lanterns making lights and shadows move around them both. Then she said she had arrived, thinking it was a temporary job, that she would stay the necessary time and return to Atlanta with enough money to start over. And that she had discovered that starting over doesn't always happen the way we plan, that sometimes we are in the middle of a fresh start without realizing it, and only see it when we are so deep in that turning back would be going in the wrong direction. Edward said with that small and real smile that he liked that idea. She said she did too. And so, with the paper lanterns swaying softly and the scent of jasmine in the December air and Eleanor's garden all around them, something that had been growing in silence for weeks came to exist with a name, not declared in grand words, but confirmed in that quiet way, which is the truest way to confirm anything. Now, my friends, it is time for a quick pause. We are almost reaching the end of this beautiful story, and I need you to do one thing. If you are moved, if your heart is warm, leave a like now before continuing. This simple gesture helps the channel a lot. And tell me in the comments what you are feeling. I love reading every message from you. Let us move to the end. February 1935 arrived with a dry heat that made the earth harder in the morning and the smell of ripe peaches stronger in the air. The garden was in one of its most beautiful phases yet. The pink camellias in full bloom, the lavender bed with the specific grey-purple color that only lavender has, the roses in several spots with buds that opened in sequence as if obeying a schedule, and the white camellia, the oldest, the one with the twisted trunk, the one that had guarded Eleanor's notebook for 5 years and survived abandonment with the stubbornness of something that has a reason to continue, was in bloom. Not with the splendor of the years when it was tended by the matriarch, but with the specific beauty of a plant that went through a lot and still made it there. White flowers, open on several branches, with that slightly creamy scent camellias have, the petals overlapping in layers that seem too careful to be natural. The perfume was clean and gentle, the kind that doesn't insist, but is there when you pause to pay attention. Edward had gone to the garden before Amelia that morning. When she arrived, his back was to her, looking at the blooming white camellia, standing with his hands in his pockets in that way he had when he was thoughtful. She stood still for just a second, with that image, the man's back, The golden garden around them, the blooming white camellia engraved somewhere that isn't memory, but is deeper than memory. He heard her footsteps and turned around. The two of them stood looking at the camellia for a moment. Edward said, with the voice that held emotion inside but did not erase it, that his mother would like this very much. Amelia said she believed Eleanor had planned exactly this, that she had kept the notebook under this specific camellia because it was the oldest, the most resilient, the one she knew would last, that she had waited for someone with the right hands to arrive to clear the earth around it. Edward looked at her, and he said, with the direct seriousness that was how he said the most important things, that he wanted her to stay, not as a gardener, though the garden needed her and he knew it, but as part of that place, as the person he wanted to share the mornings of that garden and the conversations on that porch with, and the years that came after with everything that came inside them, the good and the hard, the simple and the complicated, what they already knew and what they would still need to learn. He said he didn't know how to do everything she deserved, but that he was willing to learn with the patience she had taught him regarding plants, slowly, paying attention, without rushing what needs its own time. Amelia stayed with those words for a full moment. She looked at him, at this man who had entered that story as a closed door and who had opened with the patience that only the things worth having demand, and felt in her chest that certainty that doesn't come from the head but from somewhere deeper, the kind of certainty her father had called a root. She said yes, that she was staying. And the white camellia with the twisted trunk and a history much longer than either of them, the one that had survived 5 years of abandonment, that had guarded a notebook and a truth and a healing, that had waited for the right hand with the patience of something with an ancient root, was in bloom at the back of the garden, with its white flowers capturing the February morning light as if they had been planted exactly for this day. The years that followed at Camellia Farm were, according to everyone who lived near that place, the most beautiful that land had ever seen. Not just because of the garden, which was restored season by season, until it reached a version that was both faithful to what Eleanor had created and different, because it had Amelia's signature mixed in. The species the Irish father had taught intertwined with the ones Eleanor had planted with love. A conversation between two notebooks that had lasted decades and that kept happening in the green and perfumed space behind the house, but because of what had changed in the people. The wedding had taken place in March 1935, in a simple ceremony in the farmyard, with neighbouring families and the residents of Deep Stone. Miss Clara had organised everything with the discreet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for that opportunity long enough to know exactly what she wanted. The garden was in full autumn bloom, the white camellias open, the roses in several shades, the lilac lavender against the stone wall. And Amelia had walked into the yard with a small bouquet she had gathered herself that morning, with flowers she had chosen not just for their beauty, but for what they said in the language Eleanor had taught her without knowing: discreet and certain love, honoured memory, fidelity that needs no announcement. Edward had stood waiting with that usual straight posture, but there was something different about it that day. A lightness that the people who had known him a long time noticed, and that Matthew summarized later with the economic precision that was his specialty. He looked like a man who had set his weight down in the right place. The vows were simple, spoken with that directness that was their native tongue, without excess ornament, but with an intensity that left some of the older women in Deep Stone with handkerchiefs in hand. In the years that followed, Edward had become, gradually unannounced in the way real things transform, a more whole man. The peace with his father, which had arrived through Eleanor's pages, had opened a space where before there had only been weight. And in that space had grown a lightness that everyone around noticed without needing anyone to explain where it came from. He managed the farm with the same seriousness and competence as always, but there was an openness in him now, for conversation, for laughter, for the small occurrences of daily life that used to pass by without him seeming to notice. Matthew said one afternoon, with a raised eyebrow and his usual dry humour, that Edward had become a person who was much easier to work with. Edward said Matthew had become easier to tolerate as well. The two exchanged that expression of male friendship that doesn't need an embrace to be real. Amelia had planted, next to Eleanor's old garden, a new space that was the natural continuation of everything. Not to replace what the matriarch had created, which continued to be preserved with reverence and with joy, but to grow beyond it. She used species from her father's green notebook, mixed with the ones she had learned on her own over the years, and arranged everything with that intentionality she had learned to recognize in Eleanor. Not decoration, but narrative. Not just beauty, but language. Joseph's green notebook, Eleanor's black notebook, and Amelia's new notebook sat on the small table in the room that had become theirs, side by side, like a small library of wisdom passed from hand to hand, across generations that never met but understood each other. Over the years, the garden became known in the region, not just for its beauty, but for its history. Families from Deepstone brought out-of-town visitors to see the space. Women who understood plants came to talk with Amelia about the species, about how to care for them, about what she had learned from her father and what she had discovered on her own. She taught with the same pleasure her father had taught her, without a teacher's protocol, but with that generosity of someone who knows that knowledge kept hidden withers, like a plant without sun. Edward had become, over time, someone who understood the garden well enough to participate in the caregiving on weekends with real competence, not a professional gardener's, but that of someone who learned through attention and love. There was a specific flower bed that was his, of declared responsibility and discreet pride. The blue hydrangeas from Charleston, the first ones he had asked about, the ones that had been the first sign that something had changed in that space. He tended them with an attention Amelia thought had something to do with his mother, with the way of honouring what Eleanor had planted by continuing to plant. Miss Clara lived on the farm until she was 82, with her lucidity intact and the smile that arrived before words. On an autumn afternoon, when she and Amelia were sitting on the porch, pressing flowers from the garden between the pages of a thick book, a technique Amelia had taught the older lady with mutual pleasure, and that had become a Thursday ritual. The old woman said there was something she needed to confess. Amelia waited attentively. Miss Clara said that when she wrote that letter to the gardener in Atlanta, she had asked Eleanor's garden to send the right person, not just someone who knew about plants, someone who knew about things that grow slowly and don't give up when the earth is hard, who knew that the most important part of any garden is not what is seen above, but what is in the root. Amelia looked at her with a smile that held both tenderness and complicity. Miss Clara said the garden had done its job well, and Amelia said yes, that the garden had done its job very well, that she and the garden agreed on that completely. Many years later, on an autumn afternoon in 1952, when the garden was in one of its most splendid phases, with the camellias open and the scent of lavender thick in the air, and the blue hydrangeas from Charleston blooming for the 17th consecutive season, anyone passing through the Deepstone area who stopped to rest at the general store in the center would find someone willing to tell the story of Camellia Farm. They would hear about the gardener who arrived with a worn suitcase and her father's notebook for a 2-week job and never went back to Atlanta. About the closed garden that had been opened, about the notebook found beneath the oldest white camellia there, about the man who had carried a hurt for years and who had learned, through his own mother's pages, that the silence he had interpreted as abandonment had actually been an attempt that failed by chance, and that the difference between the two was everything. They would hear that the garden had bloomed again, that it had become, over time, one of the most visited spots in the region, not as an attraction, but as an event, as the kind of place people took others to see after talking about it. Because some things need to be experienced for the words to make sense. They would hear that Amelia still tended the garden with the same hands that had arrived decades earlier with tools in her bag, a little slower now, but with the same knowledge in her fingers, the same patience in her gestures, the same habit of talking softly to the plants while she worked. And that Edward appeared every morning at the blue hydrangea bed, with that specific attention he had inherited from someone who taught that caring is a form of loving. And the story the people of Deep Stone told with pride, and with that warmth that only true stories possess, was always the same. Always with the same ending that wasn't a conclusion but a continuation, that the most beautiful farm in the region wasn't beautiful by chance. It was beautiful because it had been cared for by someone who understood that caring is neither a chore nor an obligation. It is a form of loving, a way of saying without words that what surrounds us matters, that what is growing deserves attention, that roots are worth as much as flowers, because without a root there is no flower. The gardener who had arrived merely to tend to the plants had become indeed the most beautiful love story Camellia Farm had ever seen. A story that had begun with a worn suitcase, a green-covered notebook, and the right hands for the right earth. A story that had grown the way the best stories grow, with roots before flowers, with patience before blooming, with the silent conviction that things worth having are worth the time they ask for. And the garden, like all things that are truly loved and with patience, never stopped growing. There was a morning in May, cold in the way only May in the Carolina mountains manages to be, with a dew that left every leaf with a drop on its tip and a low mist between the ridges that made the world seem smaller and more intimate, when Amelia arrived at the garden and found something she had not planned to find. It was a folded piece of paper, resting on the stone bench under the magnolia, held down by a small rock so it wouldn't fly away in the dawn wind. Letter paper, folded in four, with the care of someone who was not used to writing letters, but had thought about the fold attentively. Her name, Amelia, was written on the front in the handwriting she had learned to recognize from the farm's administrative documents that Edward sometimes left on his office desk when she walked down the hall. She stared at the paper for a moment before opening it. The garden was silent around her, with only the early birds and the distant sound of the cows being led to pasture. The small rock that had held the letter possessed a grey-blue colour that only certain river stones have, and it had been chosen with a care that doesn't belong to someone who picks up the first rock they find. She opened the letter. Edward had written 3 paragraphs. There were no flourishes of language, no beating around the bush. It was the kind of text that is born when someone who does not write well decides to write because they must say something they cannot say any other way, and chooses the words with the precision of someone who doesn't have excess to spend, and therefore chooses each one with responsibility. He wrote that he had tried to speak the night before and had not managed to. That there was a specific thing about words of feeling that had always eluded him. Not for lack of feeling, which was abundant, but due to a difficulty that came from long ago, from the way he had grown up believing that what is done is worth more than what is said, but that he had learned from his mother's notebook that silence sometimes lies. That silence can be interpreted as indifference when it is exactly the opposite, and that he did not want her, of all people, to interpret his silence the wrong way. He wrote that he had noticed something he had been trying not to notice since the first weeks, because noticing was complicated and not noticing was simpler, that there was a difference between the days with her there and the days he imagined without her, and that this difference was not small enough to be comfortably ignored, that there was a quality in the conversations they had in the garden and on the stone bench and on the back porch that was different from any conversation he had had before. Not because the subjects were extraordinary, but because there was a presence in everything that was specifically her presence, and not that of anyone who could occupy the same place. And in the third paragraph, shorter, more direct, with the handwriting a little firmer, like someone who had decided before starting to write that this part would not be redone or erased, he wrote that he would like to know what she thought about all this, that he understood if the answer was complicated or if she needed time, but that he had decided, after reading what his mother had written about his father, that a silence that had a solution deserved a solution. Amelia folded the letter slowly and put it in her apron pocket. She sat on the stone bench for a while with her hands in her lap and the garden around her in the cold May morning. A mockingbird landed on the lowest branch of the magnolia, looked at her with that sideways, curious bird gaze, and flew away. She went to the office before breakfast. Edward was there, standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard, with an expression she recognized immediately as the expression of someone waiting for something and trying not to show that they are waiting. He turned when he heard the door and went very still for a second. Amelia said, standing in the doorway, that she had read the letter. He said yes. She said there was something she needed him to know. That she had arrived at that farm with the intention of staying 2 weeks, maybe 3. That she had arrived with no plan beyond the work and no expectation of anything beyond fair payment. And that at some point in those weeks, something had happened that she had not planned and had not resisted, because there was no sufficient reason to resist. That she had woken up many mornings thinking about the garden and the plants, as she always had in any job. And she had also woken up thinking about the previous day's conversations and which flower beds would be visited that day, and what question he was going to ask, and that small smile that appeared sometimes so naturally she thought he didn't realize he was smiling, that she had tried to separate the work from the rest and had discovered that lately this had become difficult because the garden and the man who appeared in the garden every day had become, without warning, and without permission, part of the same thing. Edward listened to the whole thing without interrupting, with that whole-body attention that was his most honest way of being present. Amelia said the answer was yes, and Edward Sterling, a man of measured words and careful gestures, a man who had learned early on that what is done is worth more than what is said, crossed the office and did exactly what needed no words. The spring of 1935 arrived with the garden in a bloom that made Matthew pause at the iron gate one morning and stand looking long enough that 2 workers passing by stopped as well, without anyone saying anything. There was a wild orchid that had appeared in a corner near the wall that no one had planted, that had simply decided to be there, the way things that belong to a place choose that place without asking for permission. There was the rosemary bed that perfumed a 20-yard radius when the wind blew the right way. There were the pink camellias in strategic spots that Eleanor had planned with the precision of someone who understood color, light, and how the human eye sweeps across a space. And the white camellia, the old one, the one with the twisted trunk and long history, was in a bloom that seemed implausible for a plant that had endured so much. White flowers on almost all the main branches, open with that overlapping of petals that is one of the most organized things nature produces, without any human hand involved. Amelia photographed the garden that spring with the small camera Edward had bought in Asheville on a business trip, not because she asked, but because he had arrived with it wrapped in brown paper and simply said he thought she would want to keep a record. The photographs went into an album that ended up on the living room shelf next to the oldest book in the library, and for many years afterward, that album was the first thing Miss Clara showed to any visitor who came to the farm with more than 10 minutes of patience. There was one photograph in particular, taken by Matthew, without either of them having asked. On an afternoon when the 2 were kneeling side by side in the hydrangea bed with their hands in the dirt and their faces close in a work conversation that stayed on their bedside table for all the years that followed. Not because it was technically the best photograph, but because it captured something that struggled to be described in words, two adults in a flower bed, completely in the right place. Matthew had said, upon delivering the developed photograph weeks later, that he had just happened to be passing by there with the camera at that exact moment. That it was pure coincidence. Amelia had said yes, it certainly was. Just the same way Miss Clara's letter had been pure coincidence. Matthew had whistled and walked away. There was something about life on the farm that Amelia was discovering gradually as the seasons passed, something she hadn't anticipated when she arrived with her worn suitcase and her father's notebook that April in 1934. It was the way that space revealed people with an honesty that smaller and more conventional spaces cannot. In the city, she had been invisible in a way that doesn't hurt immediately, but accumulates. She was the gardener's daughter, the hired help, the competent girl who tends the garden and who should be treated well, but who takes up no space in parlor conversations. In Deepstone, on that farm, in that garden, in that small community where people knew each other's names and what each family had gone through, she had discovered that there was a different kind of visibility, not of exposure, but of belonging, of being known for who she was, not just for the function she performed. The women of Deepstone came to visit the garden with that pretext of curiosity about plants that was half genuine and half an opportunity for conversation. They sat on the porch with Amelia and Miss Clara in the afternoons and exchanged the kind of practical knowledge that passes from hand to hand among women who live close to the land, about vegetable planting, about herbal remedies, about what to do when the soil is too acidic or too damp. Amelia taught and learned with equal ease, because she had learned from her father that no one knows everything, and that whoever pretends to know, in order not to have to learn, misses the best parts. With Edward, there was something that was building with the solidity of a thing that is in no rush to show what it is because it knows what it is. There were nights when they sat on the back porch after dinner with the scent of the garden rolling in through the darkness, and they talked about the farm, about the harvests, about the plans for the garden in the next season, about her father's notebook and his mother's notebook, and what each had taught. There were nights when they didn't speak much, and the silence was the kind that only exists when people do not need to fill the space between them. Edward learned the names of the plants with a determination she found moving, not urgently but consistently, in the manner of someone who had decided that it mattered and who, when deciding something matters, sees it through to the end. He made mistakes sometimes, confused similar species, got the watering time wrong for some of them, and accepted correction with a humility Amelia recognized as real humility. The kind that doesn't need praise for the effort, but just wants to know what it is doing wrong to do better next time. There was a June afternoon when he had arrived at the garden earlier than usual and had found Amelia talking to the white camellia bush. That habit of speaking to the plants in a low voice she had since childhood, and had stood still at the entrance making no noise, just listening. She had noticed after a moment and had stopped with the slight embarrassment of someone caught in an intimate act. Edward had said, with that small smile that was the most honest one he had, that he had only heard the tone, not the words, and that there was a quality in that tone that was the same as the way she spoke to people she cared about, a specific attention that didn't hold anything back. Amelia had said that plants respond better when they are treated as if they understand. That her father had taught this, and that she had verified over the years that there was some truth to it. Not magic, but the attention a person gives to something when they are truly present changes the quality of the care. Edward had stood thinking about that for a moment, and then he had said, with the directness that was the native tongue of things he considered true, that he understood exactly what she was describing. That there was a difference between doing something out of obligation and doing the same thing out of genuine attention, and that he had realized over those weeks that he had gone back to paying attention to the farm in a way he hadn't in a long time, that he had returned to seeing things, the peaches on the branches, the cattle in the pastures, the afternoon light on the roof tiles, with a presence he had lost without noticing and had found again without knowing exactly when. He said there was a correlation with her presence in this and that he wasn't certain it was a coincidence. Amelia had looked at him for a second, with dirt on her hands and the oblique June sun in the garden. She had said that the white camellia had bloomed again. He had said yes, that he had noticed, that he had. And the two had stayed there, in that shaded corner beneath the magnolia, with the garden around them, and that clarity that sometimes arrives before words, and is more honest than any elaborate declaration could be. The summer of 1935 at Camellia Farm was the hottest Matthew remembered in years, the kind of dry heat that parches lips and makes the earth crack if not properly tended. Amelia had prepared the garden for this before it arrived, with the anticipation she had learned from her father that plants must be strengthened before adversity, not during. She had turned the soil in the main flower beds to improve moisture retention. She had mulched around the most sensitive species with dry straw from the farm. She had adjusted the watering times to early morning and late afternoon when evaporation was minimal. The garden made it through the summer with a dignity that was a direct result of the preparation. Some species suffered more. The roses needed extra attention. 2 bromeliads that were in full sunbeds were moved to partial shade on a day when Amelia noticed they weren't reacting well, but nothing was lost. By the end of the summer, the garden was, paradoxically, stronger than when it entered. Like certain things that emerge from hardships more whole than they went in, because hardships reveal what good weather sometimes hides. Edward had watched this process with the attention of someone learning something that goes beyond what is being taught. Seeing in the way Amelia cared for the garden in hard times, a principle he recognized in other things. The idea that preventative care is worth more than a late cure. The idea that understanding what is coming allows you to prepare what is present. The idea that the garden needs the gardener not only when it is blooming, but mostly when the sun is harsh and the rain does not come. He had told her this on a February afternoon, when the heat was at its peak, and the two were on the back porch with fresh water from a clay pitcher, watching the garden endure with that dignity that well-prepared things possess. Amelia had said she had learned that from a mistake, that she had lost an entire garden to a dry summer when she was 23, right after her father's death, because she had been negligent with the preparation, that she had arrived at the garden during the first heat wave and found plants that could no longer be saved, that she had sat in the dirt of that dead garden for an amount of time she couldn't measure, with her father's notebook in her lap, and a sorrow that was a mix of grief for the garden and grief for the father who would have known how to prevent it. That she had promised herself that day that she would never again be negligent with preparation, that truly caring meant anticipating, not reacting. Edward had listened to that with an expression she had learned to recognize as the expression that appeared when something touched a place that was important. And then he had said, with a quietness that carried the weight of things thought out before they are spoken, that there was something in what she described that was very familiar. That he had spent years reacting to things that could have been anticipated, the distance with his father being the most painful of all, because he had confused pride with principle, and that he had discovered, through his mother's notebook and the months that had passed, that true principle isn't afraid to yield when it is the right thing to do. Amelia had said her father used to say that the strongest plants weren't the ones that never bent in the wind, but the ones that bent and bounced back. Edward had stayed with that for a moment. And then he had said that there was a specific person who had taught him that during those months, without using exactly those words. She had understood. She had sat quietly with the understanding for a moment. And then she had said that there was something her father also used to say, which she reserved for the truest things she knew, that the plant that survives the dry summer, without losing its root when the rain returns, blooms better than it ever bloomed before. The garden was there all around them, getting through the heat with dignity, full of ancient roots and flowers that came when it was their time. Thank you for staying until the end of this story, my friend. If your heart squeezed at any moment, if you closed your eyes for a second while the garden bloomed, if you felt that good longing for something you perhaps don't even know how to name right, then this story did exactly what it needed to do. Tell me in the comments what you felt. Tell me if you have a garden, if you have someone who cares for you with all this patience, if this story reminded you of someone special. I read every message with the greatest affection in the world. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, share it with someone you love, and we will meet in the next story here on the channel. Until then.